This is the Kofford Books AuthorCast. I'm your host, Brian Whitney. Michael Lawson received his bachelor's and master's in English from Brigham Young University and his PhD in English literature from the University of California at Santa Barbara. He is the author or editor of 7 books and more than 50 articles, book chapters, and reviews. His books include New Testaments, a study of biblical typology in the 17th and 18th centuries. That's Not What They Meant, an analysis of the debates of America's founding fathers, and Useful Fictions, an exploration of the connections between cognitive psychology and literature that was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title for 2011. His composition textbook, Reading the World, Ideas That Matter, is used in more than 200 colleges and universities worldwide. In Rereading Joke, Understanding the Ancient World's Greatest Poem, winner of the Association for Mormon Letters Religious Nonfiction Award, Michael demonstrates how most readers have largely misunderstood this important work of Scripture and provides insights that enable us to reread Job in a drastically new way. In doing so, he shows that the story of Job is far more than a simple story of faith, trials, and blessings that we have all come to know, but is instead a subversive and complex work of Scripture meant to inspire readers to rethink all they thought they knew about God. In this episode, we interview Michael Lawson. So before we get started talking about your book, let's just go ahead and get a little background on you and what led to your interest in writing about the topic of Job.
Fair enough. I am currently the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Newman University, which is a Catholic institution in Wichita. So I'm kind of a professional Catholic and practicing Mormon. I have a PhD in English from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and I studied primarily 17th and 18th century British literature at Santa Barbara and went on the job market. This was back in the late 1990s, thinking that I was going to find a position where I would just spend all of my life studying 40 or 50 years of British literary history and teaching that to students, which of course didn't work out. I got a job where I spent half of my time teaching world literature to non-majors, most of the rest of it teaching freshman composition, and once a year or once every other year a course in 18th century British literature. So I spent a lot of time teaching out of the Norton anthologies of world literature, the sort of Plato to NATO omnibus 2-semester course that I taught on the classics of world literature, one of which, because it was required by the syllabus, the standard syllabus that we all used, was the Book of Job. And so I taught, and at the time, the Norton Anthology used the King James version of the Book of Job. They have now switched to the Robert Alter version, which Norton published. But for 12 years, I taught Job every semester to non-majors at Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And I had to encounter Job from the academic and secular perspective. This was a state university. And it just hit me dramatically how different that Job, the one just in the introduction and footnotes to the Norton Anthology, and also in the literature that I read to prepare for class, how different that Job was from the Job that I had encountered in seminary, as a missionary, in my BYU religion class. It felt like 2 different stories of Job. And indeed, it was 2 different stories of Job, because my church life had focused on the frame narrative, which was the first 2 chapters of Job and the last half of the last chapter, whereas in my scholarly and teacherly life, I was focusing on the poem and the lamentation of Job. And it took me quite a number of years to piece together the difference between how I had learned to understand Job as a Latter-day Saint and how I came to understand Job as a scholar and a teacher. And I have been wanting to write a book about this for some time, and I finally found that I had the time to do that, and that's where Rereading Joke comes from.
How would you introduce this to your students at the beginning of this section?
I would say, and this is in the book, but I would say, imagine that there was a great feminist poet in the United States who wanted to tell the Cinderella story. And this is what she does. She takes the Cinderella story that we all learned from the Disney movie and starts to tell that story, starts to talk about how Cinderella couldn't go to the ball and how she had a fairy godmother and all of the tropes that we associate with a Cinderella story. And then imagine that after about 5 pages of this, she breaks in with a poem called Cinderella's Lament, in which Cinderella speaks rather than the narrator speaking. And Cinderella contradicts everything that's in the story. She talks about how silly it is that she's expected to go to this ball, how dumb it is that this prince who's supposed to be in love with her can't even recognize her without putting the shoe on, how silly it is to think that anyone would want to marry a prince just because he's a prince, and just gives 10,000 lines of brilliant poetry, completely deconstructing the frame tale or the Cinderella story that we know. And then at the very end, she tacks on the ending where Cinderella marries the prince and lives happily ever after. And they could all usually see what I was saying there. And I would say this is more or less what happened with Job. There was a Persian fairy tale, or a folk tale, a children's story, about a man who was righteous, who was tested by God, who had everything taken away from him by God, and he just sat there and took it patiently and said, "Naked came I into the world, naked shall I leave it. Glory be to God." And then we get 10,000 lines or 10,000 words of very exquisite poetry in which Job encounters his interlocutors, and Job does nothing but complain, insists that he's innocent, insists that God is punishing him unfairly, insists that God get down here right now and answer his objections. And then we go back to the frame, but that story has been deconstructed. The frame story has been subverted by the poem, and that's the intention of the poem. One of the greatest poets to live in the ancient world encountered this story, understood that it was a story that gave some very simplistic value lessons, and wrote a poem in the mouths of some of the main characters to use this frame as the basis of a critique.
So it sounds like this early writer was kind of a prototypical post-structuralist in a way.
A pre-post-structuralist. I mean, he was somebody who used a story in order to subvert a story. And that's a very old tradition that somebody will take a known story and subvert it. Over in Greece, Euripides did this quite frequently. When he told the story of Medea, he's telling the story of someone who was a villain of the Greek world, and he's making her sympathetic. He's using the story that exists, but putting words into the mouth of the heroine in order to subvert the story. So there's a long tradition of oral narratives being interpolated into literature in a way that uses the literature to critique the story.
Now, going along the same lines, you referred to it in the title as the ancient world's greatest poem. Can you elaborate on what makes it the ancient world's greatest poem?
Well, that's a value judgment, clearly. Some people will say that the Odyssey or the Iliad or the Aeneid or the Ramayana is the ancient world's greatest poem, and I have no great argument there. I think that it's Job because of the way that Job interacts with his God. Most of the poems of the ancient world are about the relationship of human beings to deity. In most of them, human beings either accept the judgment of the gods or they reject the judgment of the gods and shake their fists and go down in flames. Job is the only poem in which the hero demands that God be just. And I see that as a real innovation in this poetry of the ancient world, which is almost always about gods interacting with human beings. But only Job demands justice of his God. And I think that plus the beauty of the language and the intricate relationship between the frame and the poem, I think stylistically it's excellent. But conceptually, it takes that relationship between the human and the divine to a place where no other ancient poem is willing to go.
Greg Kofford Books is pleased to announce the Mormon Image in Literature series, edited by Michael Austin and artist E. Partial. The Mormon Image in Literature reprints important literary works by and about Mormons, from the sensational anti-polygamy books and dime novels of the Civil War era to the first attempts of Mormon writers to craft a regional literature in their Great Basin Kingdom. Each volume contains a critical introduction, helpful annotations, and multiple appendices that enlighten and enliven the text. The first volume, The Mormoness, or The Trials of Mary Maverick, a narrative of real events, originally published in 1853, is the first American novel about the Mormons. The Mormoness tells the story of Mary Maverick, who joined the Mormon Church when her husband was converted in Illinois. Though not initially a believer, Mary embraces her identity as the Mormoness when her husband and son are killed in a Hans Mill-like massacre. And at the end of the novel, she must find a way to forgive the killer. The Mormoness will be available January 26, 2016. Pre-order your copy today at gregkofford.com. Many refer to this as the most challenging text in the entire Hebrew Bible. What do you think makes it so challenging?
First of all, it is very complicated poetry. Not much of the Hebrew Bible is as linguistically complicated in English. I don't speak Hebrew, so I have to take people's word on how complicated the Hebrew is. But in English, it's just one of the hardest to understand. But also the fact that the frame is easy to understand. That fairy tale that's being contradicted by the poem is easy to understand. It's easy to read. So people read Job, they read the first two chapters, and they think they know what it's about. And then the really hard stuff hits, and they tend to just gloss over that, and then they get to the end, and they assume a continuity that's not there. So the structure of it is difficult because very few other books in the Bible are intentionally designed to work against themselves. And the book of Job is.
Now, this may be an obvious question, but some people take issue with it even being called a poem. What do you think the challenges are about trying to read Job as a literal history?
Well, I think that whether or not it's literal history doesn't determine whether or not it's a poem. The King James Bible is the only Bible that I'm aware of that doesn't print the middle portion of the middle 90% of Job as poetry. What makes it poetry in Hebrew is the use of a kind of parallelism that uses two lines that relate to each other in certain very specific ways. Robert Alter's marvelous book, The Art of Biblical Poetry, talks about this poetic style. And this style is used in books that are history, or that many people take as history. We see it in Isaiah, for example. We see it in a lot of the works of the prophets. So whether it's poetry or not, does not determine whether it's history or fiction. I think people have a very difficult time reading Job fictionally, or saying that there was not an actual person named Job. And I'm agnostic on that question. There may well have been a person named Job at some point in the ancient world, just as there may well have been somebody named Odysseus or King Arthur. We know that there was a person named Roland, who was one of Charlemagne's knights. That doesn't mean that everything that happens in the poem is historical. I think that there are two reasons that people want to read Job historically. The first is the feeling that if any part of the Bible is not historical truth, then no part of it is historical truth. Or any book of the Bible being non-historical literature would cast doubt on all of the other books of the Bible. And I don't think that's the case. The Bible is not a single book. It's a library. Bible roughly means library. There are history books and law books and books of prophecy, books of poetry, short stories. There are all kinds of different texts in the Bible. And reading the literature as literature does not mean you can't read the history as history. I believe that texts usually tell us how we're supposed to read them if we know how to look at them. And I think it's completely possible to read the literature of the Bible as literature without casting doubt on the historicity of the history. The other reason with Job that people want to consider it historical is that the frame version of Job is such a wonderfully religious story. I mean, it says all the kinds of things we want to say religiously. Job has patience. Job loves God. Job is tested. Job never denies God. Job never complains. And he is rewarded in the end with twice as much stuff as he had when he started and just as many children. And thus we see that if we are patient and we are tested and we don't deny God, we will be rewarded at the end with lots of stuff. That's a great message. That's the message that the story version of Job wants to convey. That's also the message that the poem version of Job wants to subvert, because the poem version of Job wants to tell us that life isn't that simple. You don't always get rewarded when you're good. You don't always get punished when you're bad. Sometimes bad things happen for no reason that we're capable of understanding. But we don't want to put that on a flannel board and teach it to children in primary. We don't want to give sacrament meeting talks about Job cursing the day that he was born and reviling the breasts of his mother that gave him suck that he would live from his infancy. That doesn't make for good flannel board stories. It doesn't make good primary songs. It doesn't make particularly strong sacrament meeting talks. So the dual nature of the book of Job that has a poem that subverts a story that we like offends us. We would much rather it all be about the patient, God-loving, God-fearing person who never complains. And so I think that a lot of times we try not to notice that most of Job really is about Job complaining.
As you were writing this book, and I know that you spent a lot of time educating students on Job and pondering this, but as you're putting together this book, what further insights have you personally gleaned into the story of Job?
I think the most profound thing that I realized about Job when I was writing this book, which I had not taught students before, which I had not worked into my lectures before, is not about Job. It's about his comforters. And as Job's comforters try to convince him that he must be guilty of something because they don't want to deal with a world in which virtue is not always rewarded and vice is not always punished. So they end up rejecting Job because they're not willing to change their ideology, and he refuses to conform to their ideology. And I look around at how the world works today and sometimes how we as Latter-day Saints interact with other people. I think we're guilty of that too. We're guilty of doing what Job's comforters do when we take an example that's very much in the news right now is the issue of homosexuality. A lot of Latter-day Saints simply say homosexuals cannot exist. God would not create somebody like that. If somebody feels that attraction, they are choosing it. It's a choice. It's a decision that they make because the God that I believe in is incapable of making somebody that way. And I've heard that over and over again in the time that I've participated in the church. And that is us being Job's comforters and saying, your existence offends my ideology. I am therefore going to deny your experience. And I look at all the other places that we do this. This is not an argument between Job and his comforters about Job's morality. This is an argument between Job and his comforters about Job's very existence. They reject his right to be who he is. They would rather reject him than accept him and have to change the way they think. And it was a profound insight to me that I do that a lot too. And that many people will reject other people's experiences simply because they are unwilling to revise their ideologies. And to me, that has become the most important message of the book of Job, is don't do that.
As a final question, what do you hope that your readers will take away from this book?
I think that if they will take away from the book the idea that Job is more complicated than they originally thought, and the idea that Job is a wonderful work of literature that can be read and understood as a book of literature and still be understood as revelation from God, because God can work through literature as easily as he can work through history to inspire us. That's what I want people to understand, that reading Job as a great work of literature doesn't make it less divine or less revelatory. That literature, great poetry, great narrative, these are perfectly legitimate ways for God to speak to human beings.
And in the end, I suppose we're really all just telling stories, right? And whether it's a historical story, whether it's a literary story, whether it's a poetic device that we're using, it's all about communicating those ideas that we feel inspired by. And I think that your work has definitely added to the value of this text for something that we tend to take for granted quite a bit within the scriptures, and that's really an oversimplified reading of it. I really appreciate the depth that you bring to it, and appreciate the time that you spent with us in this podcast.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
That was Michael Austin, author of Rereading Job, Understanding the Ancient World's Greatest Poem, available in paperback from Greg Kofford Books. Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. You can subscribe to us on iTunes and Google Play, and be sure to like us on Facebook to receive the latest information about our authors, releases, and promotions.